Thank you very much. I'll speak loud so you can all hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be joining the Baltimore School of International Affairs and this research cluster devoted to global institutions, diplomacy, and justice. This is my first time giving a talk as part of this research cluster. It's actually also my first time even attending a session. So I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to getting to know all of you and connecting with you in the future as well. As mentioned, my name is Hynek. I'm an instructor at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Department of Political Science. I teach upper year international relations, in particular a course called Contemporary Security Issues. I've also been a college professor at politics at Sheridan College, where I taught politics and international relations within their journalism program. And then prior to that, I was a doctoral candidate. So I completed my undergraduate degree and McMaster, and then I moved to the United Kingdom for postgraduate studies. And it's these kind of different master's names, like, Master of Studies and Master of Research that we did in the UK. So, and then I completed my doctoral work in Scotland. So the topic for my presentation today is on American Christian Zionism in relation to human insecurity in the Middle East and the destruction of life in Gaza. I should start by saying that the academic study of Christian Zionism is actually a relatively new topic for me. So my doctoral work and so my post-PhD work, and I'm quite an early career researcher, was focused in the Middle East and North Africa, and I lived in Egypt. I studied political transformations there after the Arab uprisings. I looked at democratization and the restoration of authoritarianism, political violence, and sort of street activism as well. And I had a real interest in the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, so my focus was sort of on political Islam. So the study of religion and politics is not altogether new for me. I was previously focused on the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but the study of Christian Zionism is, and it is something I have taken up really less than a year ago. So the title for my presentation today is Of Rapture and Rubble, the Political and Apocalyptic Discourse of American Christian Zionists following October 7th. Now, of course, October 7th is referring to the 7th of October, 2023, the day when Hamas and other Palestinian groups breached the wall separating Gaza from Israel, capturing 11 military bases, killing 1,200 and taking 251 hostages in what has been described by Benjamin Netanyahu as Israel's darkest days since the Holocaust. Now, what followed, according to many human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, has been the genocide of the Palestinian population of Gaza. Though I should say, in light of my presentation today, that the use of the term genocide is unsurprisingly contested by pro-Israeli and also Christian Zionist practitioners. Israel's weapons of war, have destroyed infrastructure en masse, restricted power supplies, engineered deprivation and starvation by denying humanitarian aid, medicine, and food, incarcerated thousands with accounts of systematic torture and rape, and forcibly displaced over 1.9 million in a population of 2.2 million within Gaza's closed walls. And these are all experienced as collective punishment of the Palestinian population. Now, in terms of the structure of my talk today, I'm going to begin by outlining my central research question, sort of my problematique and my reasons for wanting to study Christian Zionism, especially in the American context. Next, I'm going to provide a bit of a history and genealogy of Christian Zionism. And this will include a bit of an introduction to Christian theology as well. Then I'm going to reframe Christian Zionism using the social and political theory developed by Michel Foucault, in particular, regime of truth. And I will develop this, and then I'm going to sort of demonstrate how this theoretical framework is applied within the contemporary case study of John Hagee Ministries and Christians United for Israel. Now, Pastor John Hagee is up there on the stage, and in this first slide here, I've shown a picture of one of the annual summits held by Christians United Christians United for Israel is the largest pro-Israeli Christian Zionist organization lobby group in the United States with over 10 million members. So very, very substantial indeed. And each summer they hold an annual summit in Washington, D.C. to meet with other policymakers to, advocate for new Israeli policies that would favor Israel. So to begin my central research question, at the heart of my presentation today was really this question and this problematique of how and through what processes the mass destruction of life in Gaza, how has this been possible and justified politically, ethically, morally, and even theologically. The destruction of life in Gaza has been documented over social media, shared over social media, especially by citizen journalists on the ground in Gaza, though not without concerted efforts to suppress its dissemination. And yet, despite the magnitude of this violence and our awareness of it, this has not reconfigured geopolitical power relations, at least not yet in a sustained way. I mean, the social mediatization of modern warfare and conflict is certainly a novel contemporary phenomenon. It jolts audiences across borders and boundaries in transnational and globalized space, social media worlds. Now, despite the magnitude, as I said, and our visual exposure to it, the large-scale awareness of violence has not yet halted its deployment. Now, this is not to say that everyday citizens and civil society organizations, and at least some elite political actors and liberal institutions, have not made resounding inroads to contest the violence on legal, economic, political, and ethical grounds, and their efforts have provided a sustained counter-discourse. But I contend that one explanation for the continuation of this violence is because these voices of resistance operate within and against a cultural milieu that is defined, at least in part, through the Christian Zionist logic, which is tethered to particular structures of power in the American context. So let's talk for a moment about what Zionism is and what Christian Zionism is. According to Derek J. Hensler, Zionism is a keyword which sits within the larger framework of nationalism, and its underlying current is the belief that the Jews, constituting a nation, have a moral right and historic need for self-determination within historic Palestine. Early Zionists advocated for Jewish self-determination, often in the form of statehood, as protection against severe anti-Semitism and persecution in 19th century Europe. Christian Zionism, like Zionism, is actually very far from monolithic. It's far from monolithic in terms of its geographies, its development and praxis, and as an object and subject of research. Its advocates stem from various denominations, from, say, Catholic to evangelical, and across various political ideologies as well, from liberal to Catholic, brothers from Catholic to evangelical. So within the contemporary world, Christian Zionism is most commonly associated with evangelicalism and the religious right. So what is Christian Zionism? Well, according to various scholars, firstly, it is a political form of philo-Semitism, which is love for the Jewish peoples, and Christian support for Zionism. Or it is faith-based Christian political support for the state of Israel, or it is any argument for a national state of Israel that relies on Christian theological arguments, and or it is a Christian lobby that supports the Jewish settler colonialism of Palestinian land by using biblical or theological constructs within a meta-narrative while taking local considerations into account. Now, this latter definition, provided by Mr. Rahib, who is a Palestinian Christian theologian and pastor, undeniably shifts the definition from looking at Christian Zionism to biblical hermeneutics to also exposing the movement's organized political advocacy, imperial and colonizing objectives, and the consequences of lobbying for Israel on the lives and lands of Palestinians. My theoretical approach is not going to replace the existing definitions as such, but it's seeking to anchor them more deeply in power dynamics, which are so apparent in the instrumentalization of violence that we see going on right now. All right, next I'm going to provide a short history of Christian Zionism to introduce you to a little bit of the Christian theology behind this, which may be new for some, but it's important to understand some of the theoretical or theological pillars of Christian Zionism, understand some of the overarching framework. So Christian Zionism, certain tenets and theological convictions, particular ways of, say, reading biblical scriptures can be traced at least as far back as the 16th and 17th centuries during the Protestant Reformation. This is not to say that the term Christian Zionism was then, it wasn't used until the very late 19th century. But these early tenets and theological convictions can be traced back to the Protestant Reformation. According to historian Robert O. Smith, the Protestant English imaginary during this period framed the Catholic Pope and the Ottoman Turk as dual and essentialized antichrists. Okay, so the Pope and the Turk were seen as antichrists. And this was also the apocalyptic perspective of Martin Luther. I think it's important to also situate any theological development within a greater socio-political context, which at the time included the Ottoman Empire's expanded military encroachment. In forming this construction of the Turk and the Islamic Turk and Catholic Pope as existential threats was a new way of interpreting biblical scripture. So literal and historical scriptural interpretation became favored over allegorical. And this was very important because this resulted in a newfound emphasis on particular Old Testament prophecies, Judeo-centric prophecies, say, in the Old Testament, as no longer only historically meaningful, but they were historically prescient for the Protestant fight against Catholicism and Islam. So we got this shift during this period where prophecy and apocalypticism, which talks about, the end times, what's going to happen in the end of days, that these were overlaid on emerging concerns of imperial expansion. And in Puritan England, the Jewish conversion to Christianity and the Jewish return to their lands of ancient biblical antiquity was believed to usher in the end times and the second coming of Christ. Okay, so it was believed that for the end times to unfold and for Christ to return, that the Jewish peoples had to convert to Christianity and then return back to their ancient biblical land. Right? So the discourse of Christian Zionism started to further coalesce, because so far it had been sort of these, you could call them proto-Christian Zionist figures. They held particular theological perspectives, but it wasn't really a political approach, and say as such. But the discourse started to aggregate when these theological convictions became politically repurposed, especially for British colonial and imperial pursuits in the 19th century. This included advocating for the return of the Jewish peoples to the Holy Land. One of the most influential and the first British lobbyists for a Jewish state in Palestine was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who lived from 1801 to 1885. And he was an evangelical Anglican minister and a member of Parliament. And he began lobbying for the restoration of the Jewish peoples to their ancient biblical lands, which at the time, of course, was Palestine, which was under Ottoman rule. The Jewish return would serve several functions. Firstly, it would solve the Jewish question in Britain, where for so long Jewish people had been persecuted. It also would secure resources and trade routes in the Middle East when the Ottoman Empire declined. And it was also believed to hasten the apocalypse. Okay, so you get these kind of various reasons as to why this might be productive. It was believed that as God's elect, Britain had a responsibility to protect the Jewish peoples and to relocate them back to their ancient biblical lands.
where Shaftesbury's efforts would lead to the opening of the British consul in Palestine. And of course, this is all in the decades leading up to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British made their support explicit for the Jewish peoples in the creation of a national homeland. All right, now, so across the Atlantic, in the American context, Christian Zionism can especially be traced through several key pre-millennial dispensationalists. And this is probably a theological term. Unless you studied Christian theology, you probably haven't heard of it, but it's important to understand in relation to American Christian Zionists. So dispensationalism stems from a man by the name of John Nelson Darby, who was a 19th century Anglo-Irish and Anglican minister. Right, so within dispensationalism, dispensationalists believe that there's a dualism where there are two chosen peoples of God. You have the church as God's heavenly chosen peoples, and you have the Jewish peoples and the nation of Israel as God's earthly chosen peoples. All right. So this diverges from a common Christian theological belief that actually the church, the birth, life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the church represent God's new covenant, which in a sense supersedes or replaces God's old covenant. For dispensationalists, they don't hold to this belief, and they still hold a very prominent role for the Jewish peoples in God's unfolding roadmap for the end times. Okay, what's going to happen in the end of days? All right. So it's quite important to know that. Also within dispensationalist theology, there's a strong belief in the rapture of the church. Perhaps you've heard of the term rapture before, because a couple of weeks ago, the church was supposed to be raptured again on, I think, September 23rd, 24th. But there's this belief that at any moment in the twinkling of an eye, the church will be raptured into the sky to meet the Lord. And then after this, the sort of end time story will unfold. This is something that dispensationalists believe, and it is common within American Christian Zionist discourse as well. So we start to see the origins here. All right, so dispensationalists also tend to read prophetic biblical texts as historic or futuristic plans for Israel. All right, so for dispensationalists, there's therefore strong emphasis on prophecy, and the modern day state of Israel is viewed as a fulfillment of God's promise. For God's clock to reset in the lead up to the apocalypse and Christ's return, the Jewish peoples need to return to Israel. All right. Now, historian David G. Hummel elaborates that this, in particular, the post-Holocaust period, is central to the formation of an evangelical and also dispensational, as I just introduced you to, coalition of Christian Zionist lobbyists who were seeking reconciliation with the Jewish peoples as a form of atonement. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 is seen by many evangelical Christian Zionists as a miracle of God and as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And this was further bolstered through Israel's victories in the 1967 war, where the seizure of Jerusalem and the West Bank became like a prophetic fulfillment for evangelical Christian Zionists. And these were signs of God's unfolding roadmap. So evangelicals wanted to make sure that they've been on the right side of the divine blueprint for the end times. And Pastor John Hagee, as I'll speak about in a moment, his story is his personal narrative and the founding of Christians United for Israel as a lobby group is really representative of this shift. And he said that he was praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and God placed in his heart this idea of bringing Christians and Jews together through mutual respect. And this later spawned Christians United for Israel as a vast grassroots organization and lobby group. These Christian Zionist organizations, including Christians United for Israel, have substantial funding and extensive international networks and infrastructures. So now, with this development in mind, I want to theoretically reframe Christian Zionism as a regime of truth, drawing from the social and political theory, the critical theory of Michel Foucault. And I think that regime of truth really helps to illuminate which discourses become authoritative in valuing those lives which are worthy as God's chosen people, and those lives which are violently cast into rubble. Foucault describes truth not as an objective reality out there to be discovered by a detached observer. Rather, it is the ensemble of rules according to which the true and the false are separated, and the specific effects of power which become attached to the truth. Okay, so therefore, truth is always embedded in systems and rules that demarcate truth from falsehood, which produce effects of power. So in explaining the regime of truth, Foucault says each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as truth, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures afforded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with what counts as truth. So there are several interconnected elements within this regime of truth. Firstly, there's discourse. And discourse is not just about language or speech acts that have little bearing on the material world. Rather, discourse is a social construct which shapes the possibility for both human speech and action in the material world. So Christian Zionism is also a discourse, and I consistently refer to it as such. And it's a system for producing knowledge, meaning, and truth claims about God's plan for the world through the central signifier of biblical Israel and the Jewish peoples, which then also gives rise to politicized speech and action in the contemporary context. The discourse of Christian Zionism, it gains legitimacy in the American public and political domain, though it's not just limited to the American context as such, but it gains legitimacy especially there through power dynamics. And the discourse then produces effects of power which are deeply experiential and tangible. In the Christian Zionist prism, the story of Israel and the Jewish peoples sit at the center of God's roadmap, and all other nations and peoples are either subsumed within that or peripheral to that. All right. And Christian Zionist discourse as a regime of truth is supported through certain theological tenets, which I sort of briefly mentioned in the last historical part, and which I'll speak a little bit more about in a minute. And these theological tenets gain mass acceptance and political legitimacy through particular apparatuses, which include, firstly, the theology, persona, and eagerness of the lead pastor, especially at some of these megachurches in the United States. And these pastors, they're not only, say, experts in articulating transcendental truth claims, but they also apply those truth claims to historical, contemporary, and futuristic political events and catastrophes. Also, the scale of their media outreach and professionalization, and the reach of their political mobilization and campaign efforts lobbying for Israel, which actually steer policy production in some sense. They inject financial capital into Israeli militarization, settlements, and state-building projects. In this regime of truth, in the Christian Zionist regime of truth, bodies are made more secure or less secure based on their positionality in relation to those truth claims, okay, which are often constructed around the legitimacy or illegitimacy of ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And the regime of truth not only acquiesces to, but seems to support the destruction of certain lives, including through contemporary campaigns of violence, based on a theology often grounded in God's prophetic roadmap that leads up to Armageddon. And I will speak more about this in a minute. So this modern matrix orchestrates a system of truth which actually shuns political struggle into binary and absolutist categorization. So you have And these categorizations align with end times eschatology. That you have good versus evil, true or false, pro-Israeli or anti-Semitic. The apple of God's eye, which the Jewish peoples are referred to as, against the unchosen, and those in support of Israel or those siding with Islamic terrorists. So if you don't support, Israeli state-making projects or militarization, then you're often anti-Semitic or siding with Islamic terrorists. All right, so now let's talk about, have some knowledge now about regime of truth, and I want to now discuss how this may manifest in a contemporary Christian Zionist movement, in particular looking at John Hagee Ministries and the affiliated lobby group Christians United for Israel. So in 2018, Pastor Hagee was recognized by the Israeli government as one of the top 70 most influential contributors to enhancing the American-Israeli relationship. Significantly, he has also served as an evangelical advisor to President Donald Trump, and he provided the benediction at the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem, which of course was a very politically divisive decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. This section of my presentation is really based on quite an extensive analysis of Pastor Hagee's sermons preached to Cornerstone Church, San Antonio, Texas church. These are also available on YouTube. I've also listened to Pastor Hagee and other Christian networks during this period. And within my study, I've also incorporated Christian United for Israel, this is the lobby group's outreach, as an integral component to the study, including the lobby group's message on YouTube, X, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as their official policy agenda, daily briefings, and educational and news-related analysis. And I get their news update every single day following October 7th. In general, my analysis has focused on this period beginning and after October 7th, 2023, and/or has also focused on, say, interviews or sermons that relate to Armageddon and end times eschatology, which would then feature Jerusalem, Israel, and/or how to frame the Israel-Hamas war within this greater framework. So, Christian Zionism as a regime of truth is reinforced through particular reading of biblical scripture, in particular books of the Old Testament and Old Testament prophecy, and also the book of Revelation. And this way of reading it is articulated as an indisputable truth by its leading practitioners, including Pastor Hagee. There is an ardent and proactive support for the establishment of a Jewish state and the return of the Jewish peoples to and their restoration and settlement in the land of biblical antiquity, or the Holy Land, also known as Zion. In the imaginaries of Christian Zionists, especially those of an evangelical persuasion, this process of the return of the Jewish peoples is wedded to biblical prophecy. The creation of the state of Israel in 1948 is projected by Christian Zionists. It is seen as the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, and they'll often reference here in Genesis, where it says, "Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt onto the great river, the river Euphrates." So through this covenantal framework, there is a direct genealogical lineage and a divinely inspired lineage that begins with Abraham and extends through the biblical patriarchs and to culminate in the modern day state of Israel. So through this vantage point, the contemporary state of Israel and its Jewish citizens become almost like statically superimposed. They're transposed and projected across millennia, time and space, onto the ancient Israelites and their land. In fact, like the ancient Israelites are seen as one and the same, the current Jewish citizens. It is a truth that is God's land given to the Jewish peoples, even if this land has historically been inhabited by other groups. Say Palestine as land historically inhabited by the Palestinian population is neither a central nor subsidiary consideration within the framework of Christian Zionism. In the regime of truth, It is the Jewish peoples who are positioned as the heirs and they'll use the word indigenous as well, the indigenous inhabitants of Israel, and whose land has been occupied over millennia by various empires. So they'll sort of repurpose this same language of occupation and who's indigenous to the land to support Israel. Arab and Muslim inhabitants are not really acknowledged as having agency or history within the same geographic space. This is in part tied to their ancestry, their biblical ancestry as descendants of Ishmael in the Bible, who was Abraham and Hagar's son and the half-brother of Isaac, who was seemingly excluded from God's blood and real estate covenant with Isaac's Jewish descendants. And Pastor Hagee also references biblical scripture when God pronounces judgment against those nations who have scattered Israel and divided her lands. So consequently, there really can be no proposal for a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians due to this exclusivity within the fixed covenants within the Christian Zionist regime of truth. Now, second scripture here, which according to historian David G. Hummel is really the organizing principle of modern Christian Zionism, connects with what is known as prosperity theology. With God saying to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Prosperity then becomes transposed from those in relationship with Abraham to those who are rewarded for blessing the contemporary state of Israel. And this prosperity reaches different social strata, touching the individual, their family, church community, state, and even the level of the nation state. All right, and this framework is also operationalized through its inverse. So those who say criticize Israel or make protest against Israeli state-making projects, violent ones, will actually fall out of God's favor, including those states that are critical of Israel's military response in Gaza. So they will not be prosperous, God will not be happy, and good things are not coming to them, basically. Okay, I want to speak for a brief moment now about eschatology, which is really what's going to happen in the end times. What's going to happen in the end of days for these evangelical Christian Zionists, like Pastor Hagee. All right, so why is Israel so important in the end times? Israel is the supposed geographic and sacred location for the prophesied Battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. And this is a catastrophic episode of bloody finality between Israel and her enemy armies, ushering in the second coming of Christ. Now, the prophetic eschatology preached by Pastor Hagee literally sketches, and this looks a little bit challenging to follow, but a literal 7-year period known as the Great Tribulation. At the beginning of this period, the church will be imminently raptured, as I mentioned, which is when Christians will basically ascend to heaven, and they're going to miss out on these horrific battles that will follow. This is preceded by the tribulation, when an earthly antichrist will arrive and form a peace treaty with Israel. But during this time, the antichrist will start to subvert people, and he'll want to be worshipped or threaten to kill all those who do not worship him. And consequently, Jewish people, a whole bunch of them are going to flee to Petra. Anywho, the 7-year treaty is broken midway through with something called the Gog-Magog War, which is when Russia and Iran and many other anti-Semitic, God-hating nations are going to basically wage war on Israel. It continues to go on, but basically God will destroy all of Israel's enemies, and then China is going to march through a desecrated Euphrates River. There's going to be this epic battle known as Armageddon between the king of the east and the king of the west. And eventually, Christ is going to return with all the raptured Christians, and he quote unquote says, killing everybody that is on the battlefield. His garments are soaked with the blood of Israel's enemies. Now, eventually, the Antichrist will be cast into a lake of fire, and a new heaven and a new earth will form in Jerusalem, where Christ will reign as king, and humanity will once again find itself in sort of a reformed Garden of Eden. So we can see within these battles this dualism between God's chosen peoples and land and their, well, largely Islamic and Arab enemies. In the contemporary context, I think this myth of an essentialized conflict with the Islamic world, including during this tribulation period, can sustain Islamophobic tropes. And this can lead to the securitization of Palestinian populations, especially if they are tied to Hamas-linked terrorists. And this securitization process also precludes a more substantive critique of any Israeli violent state-building projects and the resultant harms on Palestinians within the context, including of the Israel-Hamas war. The violence is consistently justified by Christian Zionists through the lens of Iran-backed proxies and Islamic terror groups, including Hamas, who are intent on destroying Israel. And an effect of this securitization discourse is that Palestinian lives also become depoliticized, or they're securitized as terrorists, or they're made extraneous and they are consigned to the margin of politics. But in any case, the everyday Palestinian remains eerily silent within this whole setup. Now, Christian Zionism as a regime of truth is also publicly performed through concerted political activism and lobbying for Israel. And indeed, I argue that lobbying efforts further solidify Christian Zionism as a regime of truth via financial injection for enhanced Israeli militarization, explicit support for Jewish settlements, including in the West Bank, and an overt and uncontestable support for Israeli state-making projects and legislative initiatives aimed at shaping congressional attitudes and policy production. And I'm especially just going to focus on some of their lobbying efforts following the October 7th period. Okay. So the lobby has really been formative in passing the 21st century Peace Through Strength Act. These are some of their kind of legislative snapshot. The 21st century Peace Through Strength Act, which includes security provisions and $14.3 billion in emergency aid for Israel, including funding for Israel's Iron Dome and David Sling defense systems and the transfer of US equipment stocks. Now, I have an excerpt here from Senator Lindsey Graham and his vocals from last year's Christians United for Israel annual summer summit. And I think this passage here really demonstrates some of the discursive markers and the central discursive markers within the Christian Zionist Christian truth audiences and political representatives often hear about Iran and its proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah, as central demonic signifiers within the discourse. As such, Christians United for Israel, Christian United for Israel's Action Fund, has prioritized the Iran Sanctions Enforcement Act in their legislative snapshot, which provide funds to the development of homeland security for investigations and seizures of property, which violate US sanctions on Iran and the seizure of Iranian oil exports. So here's Senator Lindsey Graham saying, people ask me, what is this thing that Christians, with Christians in Israel? It's a God thing. It's a God. Why do Christians like Israel so much? Because we get our news from the Bible. In the Bible, Israel is a good guy. I was raised to understand that God blesses those who bless Israel. And that's my foreign policy. And that's not that complicated. We need to be clear who the great Satan is. It's Iran. We're going to stand with Israel to give them the weapons they need that they can't afford to lose. And we can't afford to lose. Why do they need 2,000-pound bombs? Because there's tunnels with Hamas fighters in them, and the nuclear program in Iran is underground. America needs Israel maybe more than she needs us. America needs to be more in favor with God and not less. If we turn our back on Israel, he will surely turn his back on us. Then he looks to the audience and says, I'm putting ideas on the table that someone needs to put on the table, and I need soldiers behind these ideas, and you are the army. You're God's army. So there's a focus, going back to this legislative snapshot, also on hate speech and anti-Semitism, advocated in the Countering Hate Speech Against Israel by the Federal Contractors Act, and the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. For Christians United for Israel, the violence of October 7th was caused by anti-Semitism deployed through terrorist acts by Iranian proxies. Now, this legislative initiative prohibits the federal government from entering into contracts with companies and organizations that engage in boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, the BDS movement, under the pretense that BDS is categorically anti-Semitic. Connectedly, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act provides statutory authority for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to favor the definition of anti-Semitism used by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Civil society organizations, however, have voiced that this definition has been invoked to suppress non-violent protests and political action and speech that is critical of violent practices of the Israeli state. So then the Christian Zionist regime of truth is structured through this instrumentalization of the anti-Semitic category when it is invoked to label those just also advocating for the human rights of Palestinians, including the over 19,000 children killed in Gaza since the war began. This has resulted in the weaponization of hate speech and anti-Semitism within the regime of truth, which prevents also well-specified and meaningful political and legislative action that would also better protect the Jewish population. Labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic ends up creating a shield of immunity around even violent practices and militarization, and it may shift focus away from legitimate acts of harm also committed against the Jewish people. The legislative focus for the Christian Zionist regime of truth correlates with silencing the atrocities committed against Palestinians, which cyclically intensifies insecurity for Jewish populations as well, both in and outside of Israel. And now I just want to conclude by saying that our mass visual exposure to and awareness of the violence in Gaza has not really yet shaken the contemporary Christian Zionist regime of truth, because within its logic, this violence is productive of Israeli state building and expansionism, and therefore also signals God's prophetic roadmap for the security of both Palestinians and Israelis. The boundaries within this regime of truth require a deconstruction and dismantling, a reimagining, whereby security is not contingent upon the complete destruction of one's political adversary, no matter how many civilians are killed in the process, but to their enduring and united security. All right. Thank you very much.
From just tweets, posted by Christians United for this week, that I just put up snapshots. Thank you very much.